From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. This is Evan Barrett, and tonight we have a special guest. You won't need to be introduced really, because I think we all recognize him, but our special guest in this segment is Pat Williams. Pat served as congressman for Montana in the House of Representatives for the longest consecutive period of anyone in the history of Montana, from 1979 through into 1997, 18 years. But Pat got his start right in the period of the Crucible of Change. And it makes him very aware of all the changes we're talking about that occurred in Montana dramatically during this time. Pat started off as an educator and teacher in Butte. I want to say, before we get to Pat with some questions and discussion, a little disclaimer. Pat and I have had a long-standing personal relationship, mostly positive, for basically 43 years. And I was the manager of his campaign for Congress in 1978. I'm very proud of that, and we'll be discussing that later in the program. But right now we're going to start talking about Pat's early days and in the 1960s. Pat, welcome to In the Crucible of Change.
Evan Barrett, it's nice to see you.
Yeah.
And how many years did you say?
43, 44, something like that. Yeah.
God, you're getting old.
You know, you started as a state legislator. That was your first cut in real politics, electoral politics, and you were elected in 1966 for the first time to the legislature, and that was the first election inside the period of change we're talking about. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about your running for the legislature in Butte and what it meant at that time, what it took to decide to run and to get out there and actually do it.
Well, there was something about the change in the air that one could almost smell the demand and the need for reform, for a somewhat different kind of politics, undefined at that point. But I thought one of the things that change demanded was younger members getting elected to the legislature. I also thought it demanded more women getting elected to the legislature. So being young, I threw my hat in the ring and really worked hard, campaigned very, very hard to get elected. And I was surprised at how friendly and supportive, to a degree, people were as I'd knock on their doors. That too signified something was up. There was some change in the air, and it was being driven by the constituency, driven by the people.
Well, you had the big challenge then because of the way reapportionment had played out. My recollection was that the federal Supreme Court said we got to have one man, one vote, and the legislature of Montana was unable to come up with a reapportionment plan, and so it was imposed by a federal court, the federal district court, and that meant that all the people running in Butte they didn't run in districts, they ran countywide, so your constituency was every single house, every single door, every single voter of Butte Silverbow. How did you approach that challenge given this kind of need to deal with, work with people and talk to people?
Yes. Well, another way to put that, no more accurate than the way you have, but another way to put that change is that with regard to one person, one vote, and running countywide, is that, as your viewers and others know, today one person runs against one person, basically, at least in the general elections.
District thing, yeah.
It's one-on-one. Back then, anybody could file countywide. All of their names would be on the ballot, and you'd get to select whatever it was in that county, however many members of the House, the legislature in Helena, however many that came from that county, would be elected. So let's say the top 4 would win. I think there were 7 or 8.
In the case of Butte, it was vote for 7. Or
yeah,
you may vote for 7.
I think there were 6 or 7 of us, but there were, I don't know, 10 of us or 12 of us that ran.
Oh yeah. Now what did you do? Did you actually try to conquer every door of Butte or something like that?
I don't think I got all of them, but I didn't get thrown out of any of them, so I felt pretty good about that. I tried to go to all the doors in the county. You can't quite make it, you know, life's not long enough, but I went to a lot of doors.
Yeah,
and got a lot of ideas, by the way, a lot of ideas.
I think part of when we talk about the empowerment of people, it's not just the empowerment of them to vote, but for them to have ideas and have them, you know, go upward, if you will. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. How did that work out for you? Because you were a new guy, and there were a whole bunch of established legislators running. Right.
Well, because it was within this era of change, you know, sort of at the, not quite the beginning of it, but pretty close, that decade. People were supportive, as I said earlier, of a young person running. But the other thing I noticed at the doors is they did, as I've said, have ideas. And the ideas centered around reforming the legislature, making it less dependent or less adherent to one might say the old bosses, and including corporate bosses, and more in tune with what people wanted. So I would hear at the doors about, we have to reform things here, we need to do this. I didn't hear it at Democratic or Republican meetings. I didn't hear it talking to the then legislators before I was one. They were all still a little resistant to reform and change. But I heard it at the doors. You got to listen, but you can hear it.
You know, we talked about the first 75 years of Montana's history. We were really like a corporate colony of the Anaconda Company and other interests that were affiliated with them, and that breaking out of that and removing the corporate collar was part of what occurred during this period. So you were sensing that built up demand for that kind of thing at the doors. But, you know, they were nice to you, but how did you do?
I ran really well. Out of all those wonderful candidates, boy, there were some good candidates on the ballot. Now, they were all older than was I, but they're really good candidates and very, very nice people. And out of all of them, many of them incumbents, I ran second, which startled me, and I knew I wasn't that good, but I think the change thing was there. And so I ran second, and I thought I ran second with a bit of a mission. I thought people sent me there to try to change things and do things a little differently than they'd been done before. But yeah, second out of that good pool of candidates, I was pretty pleased with that. Not as pleased as my mother, Libby. She was really proud of that. If any of your viewers remember my mom, who used to run the American Candy Shop in Butte, and I was living in Helena when I got elected, but she was she was a proud mom.
Well, and many people knew her as the hostess at Jorgensen's for many years here in Helena. Later, and when you ran for Congress. I bet she was really proud. And imagine that. It's interesting that your comment about kind of the party leaders and the establishment was not just outside the legislature, but it was inside. It was existing office holders who were kind of locked into the current thinking. I always remember the first time I saw you, there was a forum for young Democrats at the time at Carroll College. And paraded in front of all the young Democrats from all the campuses were a series of young, you mentioned the idea, younger people, young elected legislators who were emblematic of this kind of change. Russ Doty from Great Falls and Larry Fosbender from Fort Shaw. And you were one of those. And you stood up and spoke in front of, and by the way, you made an impression on me actually at the time. And
how was it? You borrowed money from me, didn't you, at the time?
You know that.
That was the impression. You got a good impression because I loaned you 10.
Put it this way, I don't want to be paying the interest rate of the late 70s. Anyway.
As you can tell, as folks can tell, we really are old friends here.
Now, when you were running in Butte, that was the epicenter of the strength of the Anaconda Company in Montana, economically, corporately, and politically. How did that, were you cognizant of that the first time you ran, and then what happened in the legislature when you got there?
I was very cognizant of the importance to Anaconda, the company, to Silver Bowl County and Butte, which I was representing. I also knew they were very well known around the around the state because the state grew out of Butte, and Anaconda was so important here from the very earliest days when Daly formed it as a company, Marcus Daly. So I was aware of that, and I was also aware, somewhat painfully, of their hold, the old Anaconda Company's grip on politics under the dome, Copper Dome, in Helena, and I thought that hold should be loosened, if not broken, and I tried to do some of that when I got to Helena.
Well, when you got to the '67 legislature, my recollection was the big central issue that year was the sales tax. And the Republicans with Speaker Jim Felt were in charge of the House, and the Democrats under Gene Mahoney were in charge of the Senate. But that was the large battle that played out. And it took center stage. But lying underneath that were some other major issues that were of import to Anaconda Company and to Butte. And you were right in the middle of those other issues, weren't you?
Well, one of the issues, as always, in any government around the world was how are we going to pay for these things that the public is demanding. Sometimes this public demands their individual need, and this public a different one. But when you put them together, the public has enormous demands. But the public also doesn't like high taxes, and that's the great dilemma for any legislator. So I understood why Anaconda Company had always opposed and usually killed any increase in any taxes that they'd have to pay. For example, there was a tax on copper called the metals mines tax, and Anaconda kept that at a very low rate for decades and decades. The state of Montana was short of money, and in my view should not depend on a sales tax for that needed revenue, because sales taxes are not very equitable. They hurt middle income and low income people, and they really don't help the better off people at all. So I tried to increase the tax. I voted to increase the tax on the Anaconda Company, first legislator from Butte in a long time to try to do that, and it was very difficult because it wasn't what a Butte guy, right, did when he got to Helena. So it was.
The last time that happened, by the way, was back in the 1920s. when the Anaconda Company supported Joe Dixon for governor, even though he was a Republican, and they were mostly Democratic at that time, and because they wanted to oppose Burton K. Wheeler, and they said, we'd rather have Joe Dixon than Burton K. Wheeler, and they went elected Dixon, and he immediately imposed a metalliferous mine tax on him. And he was, not so surprisingly, a one-term governor.
Yep.
Now, how about reclamation issues? Because Butte, that's a challenge. Did that come up even back in those days?
Well, look, I served with a lot of good legislators, and a lot of them were innovative. But I was the one that came up with restoration legislation that would apply to mining in Montana. And that hadn't been done before. And I was derided. Well, what are we going to do, Pat? Fill in the Berkeley pit? I mean, what do you mean restoration? How are we going to do this? And I thought we might start off smaller than trying to fill in the Berkeley pit, but I couldn't get anywhere with it. And I was told this will cost jobs. Well, think about the number of people that had been hired to restore landscapes in Butte and elsewhere. Would have been an enormous jobs bill. And by the way, it was actually too expensive. I mean, I know now in hindsight, the cost of doing that was way too expensive for the state of Montana.
Yeah.
It needed federal help, and years later EPA came along and Superfund to provide that help. But at the time, I was not aware, no, I don't think anybody else was either, of the cost.
Now, by the way, just a coincidence that in your first term in Congress, as I recall in the lame duck session at the end of 1980, the Superfund passed.
Yeah.
And because of that, $1 billion or more has had to be spent by ARCO and British Petroleum doing the cleanup of and with the jobs attendant to that. So it is just, now, given that you took on the Anaconda Company, if you will, I'm sure they weren't their lobbyists. Who were their lobbyists back then?
Well, they had Denny Shea.
Denny Shea was their Democratic guy.
And the main lobbyist was Glenn Carney.
Glenn Carney, yeah.
And a wonderful story. I was sitting on a bench outside of the House chamber, and the House was in session. And Shea was trying to reach a legislator and talk to him before that legislator went into the chamber, where lobbyists can't proceed, right? And so they came around the corner. The legislator is walking, and he's only 10 feet away from safety where he can get away. And Dennis Shea's struggling to grab his coattail, his coat, and Dennis is running. And his mentor, the lead lobbyist, Carney, reached out and grabbed his coattail. I was sitting right here talking to Carney. And he grabbed Dennis's coattail and he said to him, "Dennis, don't run. They'll think we're behind." I thought, how wise is this guy? He knows all the tricks.
Yeah. Now, you went back to Butte,
Yeah.
and having taken on some of the power vested interest of the Anaconda Company, maybe not planning the difficulty going in. What did that mean when you decided to run for re-election in 1968?
Well, as soon as I got home, I realized that at least some people watch what's going on in Helena in the legislature, because some of the Democratic friends were very pleased with my efforts to at least try to begin to break the stranglehold of Anaconda on Montana's politics. But frankly, for the most part, people in Butte were not very supportive of what I'd done, and the Anaconda Company was making sure that people in Butte were not very supportive of what I'd done. And frankly, because my colleagues in the Butte delegation, all really nice people, really nice, smart people, but they had to defend themselves because people were saying to them, well, this young kid, Pat Williams, is trying to raise the tax on Anaconda, and you're against that. Why? Well, of course, they had to say, well, Pat's going to put people out of work. He's wrong.
Yeah, he's wrong.
And, you know, you let that go on for a year or so, which, of course, it does between sessions. And so next time I ran, I didn't run next to the top. I ran second to last.
but you still made it.
Oh, I made it.
You made it, but yeah.
Well, about by that much.
So there's an interesting micro analysis of the impact of politics like that at that level.
And by the way, that belies what people were saying to me at the door. We want you to do things differently over there. We want you to, you're a young guy, you ought to have enough courage to take it on. And then when I did, it didn't seem very popular.
Yeah. But you made it back.
Made it back.
Now, that was '68 election. That was an interesting election nationally, but in the state of Montana in a big way, that was the election where Forrest Anderson and Tim Babcock battled out for the governorship, Babcock being the incumbent, Forrest the attorney general, running against him, and the battle was over the sales tax, what they'd fought over in '67 in the legislature. And Forrest's famous quote, campaign slogan,
"Pay more, what for?"
No one ever saw it, ever forgot it.
Yeah.
Pay more, what for?
And he meant the sales tax.
Yes.
He didn't necessarily mean all taxes.
No, pay more.
I think it would be a bad slogan for all taxes.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, I think everyone knew what he was talking about.
Yeah,
that
they
day,
did.
And by gosh, he overwhelmed the existing governor and became a new governor. And so when we went to the 1969 session, the sales tax, which had been the critical issue in '67, my recollection was disappeared from the radar screen.
was gone.
For at least a little while, they put it to bed and said no, no, no. And
Well, Forrest is governor. He's going to veto a sales tax.
Yeah.
Plus, it turned out sales tax wasn't that popular.
we found
Anyhow.
out a few years later,
Yeah,
didn't we?
right.
Yeah. Now, and Forrest brought in, and the big issues seem to have been the education funding and executive reorganization. And we have a program on that, and we won't dwell on that here. But when you were in that session, you had a seatmate. Now, you had an interesting seatmate your first session, but we had a very interesting seatmate in the second session.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
I want to say just a word. I know you've had a program on it, but I want to say a word about, I want to say a name with regard to reorganization. And the name is Duke Crowley. A lot of people remember Duke, but Duke was a genius. And Duke Crowley led the administrative effort to completely reorganize and take the fat out, and there was fat in Montana government, and he got it done. And he got it done under the demands of a Democrat governor. It was very important. My seatmate in the term before the one you're talking about was a fellow who later became lieutenant governor, and I think was one of the best office holders, even in a relatively minor position in Montana history, and that was a fellow named Bill Christensen from Hardin, Montana. Both Bill and his really wonderful wife, Hattie, have passed away now, but they were terrific. And then my seatmate and later kind of a lifelong friend in my second session was John Melcher, who people remember went on to become Eastern Montana's congressman and then Montana's senator for a good long time. John was the agriculture expert, the farm expert in both the House and the Senate. Nobody could match John's knowledge of the law with regard to protecting and encouraging Montana and America's agriculture community.
Now, he had been a state senator from Forsyth. He'd also been, as I recall, the mayor of Forsyth.
Right.
But then he was a veterinarian.
He was.
And he was a senator, and he stepped out of the state Senate to run against Jim Batten for the Eastern District Congress in '66.
That's right.
And got his
Got
head
hurt.
handed to
Got
him pretty
beat
well
up.
by,
Got beat up.
you know.
Jim Batten was a very popular member of the House, and he beat him.
But then he came back into this as a House member in the '69 session. But what happened in early '69 that thrust Melcher to the forefront?
Well, Richard Nixon appointed Jim Batten to be a federal judge, so he picked this House fellow from Montana to become a federal judge in Montana. That left a vacancy. And because Melcher had run, his name was fairly well known in eastern Montana. These were in the days when there were two members of the House from eastern Montana. As we know, there's only one now. Back then, there was an eastern district and a western district. So Melcher then ran again for the U.S. House and won. And I don't think I was a great help to him, but I tried. I stopped everything I was doing, and I went in from Butte. I was living in Butte, and which is my hometown. And I went into eastern Montana and spent several months working on John's campaign in eastern Montana. And John was tailor-made for eastern Montana as a Democrat. He was tailor-made. You know, Republicans do better over there. But it was very difficult to beat Melcher because he knew so much about their economy over there, and he was a small-town veterinarian. And when he had to run for re-election, he ran against a fine gentleman named Bill Mather from Billings.
Yeah.
And Bill had been in the legislature. And he and John were general election opponents for re-election. I think I'm right about this.
Well,
that first time.
In '69 in the special session.
Yeah.
The second time, I think he had Rehberg as his opponent.
For
Jack
re-election,
Rehberg,
you're
for
right.
re-election.
For re-election, it was Rehberg.
But
yeah.
you had
Jack Rehberg.
small town.
Jack Rehberg.
Yes, Jack
the dad.
Rehberg.
The dad. Yeah.
Small town veterinarian
Right.
against big town lawyer.
That's how we tried to portray it.
Apparently it must have worked, you know. Although it was a very narrow victory. It was 47,000 to 43,000, something like that.
Yeah.
So he won the first time narrowly, but once in, John established himself, and that was quite a race. But I think that was also indicative of a sense of change that was going on.
Yeah,
For that was in late June of '69 that this special election took place, and it's like, wow, wait a minute. They just elected Forrest Anderson governor, and now Batten is gone, and John Melcher's in. Something's going on here in Montana.
Yeah,
It seemed to
that's right.
be the kind of the ring of things. Now, did you go back to Washington with John?
I did. He asked if I'd come back. At first, I was hesitant to go back, but I agreed to do it. And Carol and one child we had then. But I came home within 3 years. But when we came home, we started out with one kid, and we came home, we had three. I think
Something in the Potomac water?
Well, I think it's the humidity.
Yeah, you know.
And we had working in Congress, whether you're a member of Congress or you're a staff person, is not easy. Those are long hours, and people have difficult choices. There's lots of mail to answer, lots of telephoning, but it was a vigorous opportunity. The thing that sort of turned me off about it all was that almost every weekend I'd watch John Melcher pack up on a Friday usually and head to the airport, National Airport, hop on a plane, be gone for a day and a half, and then come back. Members of Congress have to do that because people want to see them, and weekends are usually the only time you can get away from the Congress, except for these historic August breaks, which unfortunately some in the press call vacations. But what they really do is go home and work during that time.
It's probably disheartening to look at it and say it is every Friday night. Yeah. You know, by the way, there is a difference today in that. Now they leave on Thursday and come back on Tuesday.
Well,
it's gotten different.
Yeah,
the actual work week is only 3 days now.
Right, and sometimes it's only Wednesday and Thursday. Yeah. Now the people are being cheated by that.
Yeah, I think so.
Members of Congress ought to spend more time in Washington.
Legislating.
Absolutely.
And getting to know how to work with each other a little bit, maybe.
Boy, wouldn't that be good?
Yeah, there's a good idea. Hey, now when you got back and you were in an education role again with the Mountain Plains program, a family training program, but you were called upon when the new Constitution passed, more change. Yeah. When the new Constitution passed, and we had under the Constitution a new mode, a different mode of reapportioning legislative districts, a reapportionment commission. You were named to be one of the 5 members of that initial reapportionment commission. Can you reflect on that role and just the whole idea of it?
The state Senate appointed me to be on the reapportionment commission, which is this thing about redrawing lines, boundaries for single house seats, and then put 2 House seats together, you have a Senate seat. So it's a very complex process of redrawing political boundaries in Montana.
It has a big political impact, too.
Huge political impact. I must say, that's, people talk about gerrymandering. Well, gerrymandering comes from an old process, but the point is that's what reapportionment, that's what was referred to sometimes as reapportionment. But reapportionment commissions in Montana have, and you know, you've been part of it, have worked to try to come into the middle of fairness. Now, sometimes you have to make a choice. If you're a Democrat on the Reapportionment Commission or a Republican on it, and you draw the line over here for a district, you help your party. If you draw it down here, you help the other party. So it isn't that nonpartisanship is left out of it entirely, but members struggle to create some fairness in the state. And Montana's election results in the legislature demonstrate that.
And you know, in that new constitution, with that commission, many states still try to do it the way it was done previously,
Yes.
which is you let the legislators draw their own districts, and it's a big mess, and it's all screwed up.
Terrible idea.
And Montana has managed, with the new constitution and these commissions, to be reasonably fair and equitable in drawing these lines.
Yes.
Not perfect or anything else, but this was also something. Was there a great deal of interest of people in these results of what you were doing on the commission?
They knew what we were doing. They were confused by all the line drawing and how we came about decisions, and we didn't have computers available to us in any real way back then. So we had one assistant. We had one assistant named Alan Taylor. Back then he was a young guy. And Alan was a mathematician and a good one. And then there was a member of the Reapportionment Commission who had been appointed from the Flathead, from Kalispell. Her name is Elsie McGarvey, and Elsie McGarvey was a mathematician. So between the two of them, they were able to work out the numbers. And then those of us who had practiced politics on the ground sort of knew where the neighborhoods were and what wouldn't violate people wanting to stay together politically. The same way you keep the court requires you to keep an Indian reservation together.
Intact, yeah.
Intact,
Sure.
yes, not drawn down the middle.
Yeah.
So that this part of the reservation or this part of an intact neighborhood votes for one person, or has one person representing them, and this part of the same neighborhood is somebody else representing them. You try to avoid that, and it's difficult.
Now tell me this, and we're going to do this very quickly. I want to touch quickly on this, and then we're going to take a break and go to the 1978 campaign. But you decided to run for Congress in 1974.
All right.
And there was a three-way race in the Democratic primary, which was yourself, former Congressman Arnold Olson, and a state legislator at the time named Max Baucus. Can you just reflect on that quickly in terms of your sense of why the results turned out the way they did, because you didn't win, and how that related to this whole concept of reaching people at the grassroots level?
All right. A great old congressman from Montana named Arnold Olson had lost in 1970, lost his seat. And Arnold and I were pals. I went to Arnold after his loss, and a year had passed, and I said, Arnold, I think I'm going to run for Congress. I'm going to run for your old seat. And he said, Pat, I wish you wouldn't do it, because I've decided to run again and try to regain my old seat. And he went through the reasons he thought I shouldn't run and he should. And when we discussed it, I finally said to him, well, okay, Arnold, I'll back away. And you were a fine congressman. I'd like to see you back in there, so I won't run. And he intimated to me that if I would be good enough to do that, if he lost again, he not only, of course, wouldn't run, but he would help me.
That would be 74.
74.
Right, yeah. So in 72 he ran.
Right. And then in 74 I went to him and said, okay, he lost. And I went to him and said, okay, Arnold, I'm going to run. Yeah, fine. And then he came to me in 73 and said, you know, Pat, I really want to run again. I think I'm going to run again. And, you know, he hadn't promised me he wouldn't, but that was the kind of my understanding of it, at least my understanding of it. And so along came a guy who I've become very friendly with through the years, Max Baucus. And he got into the race, and he did that famous walk in Montana where he walked up the highways.
Gardner to Yak.
Gardner to Yak, which is a long way. It's Yellowstone to the Yukon.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a long way. Yak's a great place. And I said to Arnold, look, we both get in this, we're going to split that old kind of progressive labor vote. We're going to split Butte. We're both going to lose. And he didn't think so, and that's what happened.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to take a little break here, and
Yeah.
we'll come back with an additional special guest. So we talk about the 1978 campaign.
Wonderful.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change, and we've had a wonderful discussion so far about the early years of change in Montana with Pat Williams, the longest-serving congressman and consecutive-serving congressman in the history of Montana. It's been a good discussion so far about the early years in the Crucible of Change, and now we're going to start focusing on some dramatic episode in the latter years of the Crucible of Change, and that is Pat's election to Congress in a very unique, grassroots-oriented political campaign called Door to Door for Congress. And we're joined by another special guest, Michael Fenenbock, who again is a dear friend, but also a colleague and compatriot for many, many years. Michael is the head of Fenenbock Group, a media consulting firm of great note in the United States, but also cut his teeth as a member of the staff of the Pat Williams 1978 door-to-door campaign for Congress. Michael, welcome. It's glad.
Thank you, Evan. It was an extraordinary 1978. I would touch on something you guys touched on, that it seemed to me you didn't quite say the words, which I think what was underway in Montana was generational change. Because you had the leaving of the Montana stage of Mike Mansfield, and in the middle of the '78 election, Pat, Lee passed away. Lee actually passed away. Evan and I were in a car headed for Bozeman and heard the news on the radio, pulled over. And Evan, Lee Metcalf.
Yeah.
And Evan explained to me, as only Evan could, what that meant to Montana politics, that Lee Metcalf had passed away, and how that changed things, and also the great admiration that everybody had for Lee. So I actually see it as a generational change. Governor Judge, Pat, Melcher, all replacing these great, great standard bearers of a particular brand of progressive politics, populist politics, that I think is unique to Montana. Or if it isn't unique to Montana, it sure does feel that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, in '78 was, that's where we first met, on your lawn, and the rest is history, as we would say. But between the time when we met and the time of an election, a lot transpired, and it was like, how long did you, let's talk about your decision to do door-to-door, and then that was like 9 months of door-to-door, wasn't it, before the primary?
Yeah, it was. Of course, the first decision was, do I want to run for Congress? Because I saw how hard, when I worked for Melcher, I saw how hard these guys worked. I know people don't believe it. People are wrong. Most of these congressmen and congresswomen, there aren't enough of the latter, by the way. America's not properly represented by enough women. But they all work really hard. And I've been a hard worker all my life, growing up in Butte, working in the mines, working in my dad's restaurants. But I think I worked so hard when I was young, I didn't know if I wanted another job where I had to work like that. So first I had decided, do I want to do Congress and do it right? And once I decided that, then I thought, now the times require a campaign that somehow, I had no idea, connects directly to people, eyeball to eyeball, that direct. And together, with these guys and a fellow named Bruce Nelson and some others, we came up with this idea of not just going door to door, but doing it in a systematic, year-long or more way, keeping track of what people said to us, and then me writing them a letter about their concerns.
Personal letter.
Personal letters. And I really think it was one of the first campaigns, at least in west of the Mississippi, areas I know better, I think it was one of the first campaigns, and it did set the standard for some others, certainly in Montana, of A, the necessity to go door to door, and B, the candidate and the candidate's supporters have to be out there together going door to door, or you can't get to all the doors. So away we went.
An interesting challenge, if you think trying to knock on every door in Butte-Silverbow is tough, try the entire western half of the state.
That's right.
Now, this went on for 9 months. A team of people would go out and be from Helena with you, joined by local people and create a cadre of people that went out and knocked on doors. You did a lot of doors, Michael.
It was the sense of respect for the folks on the other side of the door. The respect for somebody who is going to talk to you from their living room or going to talk to you from their kitchen, and engaging. This is the basic hallmark of American politics, and certainly of Montana politics, and it had been a hallmark of Pat's. The crucial thing was that it had to be genuine. It wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't something that we came up with, or that Pat came up with, that said, oh, we can snooker them with something like this, or it wasn't a slogan. It was, in fact, a real movement, and we had to knock on doors, and we had to do it in a deliberate way.
And we did it by the tens of thousands.
Extraordinary.
How many?
The number when we were done was 50,000 doors. 50,000 doors. And 50,000 sets of people on the other side of the door.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the dynamic of that campaign? There were 2 campaigns. Yeah? There was a primary. And it was a primary where at the beginning, stop me if I'm wrong, Pat would not have been the favorite. But
was not the favorite.
Was not the favorite. Right. 5 people.
Right.
Extraordinary talent in that. 5, yeah.
5 or 6.
It's actually worth noting, 6 candidates:
6.
Pat, Dorothy Bradley, J.D. Lynch, George Turman, Gary Kimball, and John Bartlett. An immense amount of talent there. Dorothy in the legislature, J.D. in the legislature, George Turman, mayor of Missoula, Gary Kimball, legislator, Native American legislator, John Bartlett, great public servant.
Chairman of the Democratic Party.
Party. On the other side, a great group, Jim Waltermeyer, Tippi Huntley, Chet Huntley's widow, Bud Wallace, Bob Brown, who we know and worked with for many years, Richard Fox, and Bruce Jacobson. Immense talent going for that seat. It was going to be an open seat, and boy, everybody wanted to run for it.
And crazily, I would throw another name in. A guy named Pat Williams, a Republican from Gallusville, who threw a funny wrench in this.
It was Williams, but it wasn't.
Oh, Larry Williams.
Larry Williams.
He was running on the Senate side.
Yes.
But he, yeah.
It was odd,
very much
But people didn't know which Williams was.
He very much benefited from door to door.
He was running against Max. He was a Republican running against Max, yeah.
And people were saying.
But anyway, there were 50,000. You said there was some dynamic to it that you wanted to. 50,000 doors.
You had to go do it. The process was actually mechanical, but the explosion that happened, the dynamic that happened at the door was magic. It's political magic. That's what happens. This cadre of people would go out and knock on doors. Cold, cold, cold. I am not a Montanan. I love Montana, but I'm not a Montanan, but even Montanans were cold. And Pat never turned around and said, it's too cold, let's not go. Pat always said, no, we're going. So week after week after week, we knocked on doors. It was an extraordinary experience. Pat said he thought it was unique. My wife and I added up for some silly reason the other day that I've been involved in some 200 campaigns.
Wow.
There's the best one.
Listen, the first one's always the best one, pal.
Are we still talking about campaigns?
Oh, you thought we were talking about campaigns? Yeah. Okay, that's it.
I actually think that Evan knocked on the most doors. I think in the end, Evan was the winner of the door thing. though Bruce Nelson, our great friend Bruce Nelson, who's not here, who meant so much to this campaign, temperamentally as well as intellectually, he meant a lot. He always claimed that he knocked on the most, but Bruce wouldn't talk to anybody at the door. You know, he'd just say, "Hi, I'm here. We're doing," boom, and then he'd get on to the next one. But it was a special experience for anybody who worked on it. I remember, Pat won't like this story, but I remember Pat and I, the day before the election, just outside of Three Forks. And it was just, I don't know, I think I was driving him. And I said, "I'm just nervous as heck." And Pat looked at me and he said, "Oh, I'm not." And you weren't. You weren't. And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because I've done everything we could do, and we've done it right.
Yep.
If it doesn't go our way, it doesn't go our way."
Yeah.
But I'm
That's
confident.
true.
It was interesting that, I want to comment, that we did a ton of door-to-door every weekend, weekend after weekend after weekend after weekend. You know, right up to Christmas Day, and we did them over and over and everywhere, mechanically through the whole state. The doors weren't mechanical, but the process was. And it wasn't until quite a bit later that we made a decision to say door-to-door for Congress.
You made that decision. We're sitting around and said, what are we going to call this? We don't want any gimmicks, but we need some kind of a slogan. And we didn't know what to do, and after about a half an hour, this guy, Evan, says, "Why don't we call it what we're actually doing? Why don't we call it door-to-door for Congress?" And all of our ads had a little doorbell, you remember?
Ding dong,
Ding dong.
like the Avon doorbell.
Door-to-door for Congress, yeah.
Yeah.
That too is you,
But
by the way.
But the branding was important because it was a reinforcement. This was an exciting thing happening, a dynamic thing happening at the doors, and then to reinforce that by every time they saw an ad, they're thinking, "Yeah, these people are coming to my door and talking about it." Now that had a big impact. I think you had an experience in Ramsey, Montana, that reflected that. I wonder you might want to.
It's the last night of the campaign, and I was in Butte and going. Yeah, I guess I was just in Butte, and I thought, there's a couple hours of daylight left, and we haven't been to Ramsey yet. And so I drove to Ramsey. I thought, I can't do this. I've got to go to the last door. So I drove to Ramsey. The sun was going down. Ramsey's there aren't a lot of people live in Ramsey, and I was going up and down the 3 or 4 streets, and I felt pretty good. Most people were home, and by the time the story ends, it's dark, and I'm going back to the car, and I saw some lights on in a house way out over here in a field, and I could feel myself being pulled to go into that house, go to that house, one more door, and also pulled to the car because I was cold, right? It's November, and I thought, nope, I can't sleep if I don't go to that door, so I went to the door. Guy opened the door and said, "Oh, Pat Williams, how are you? Come on in." Shook my hand. He said, "Mary Pat's here. Get some tea." And she did, and he asked me to sit down. I had time to do it. It was the last door. I sat down, and he went over to the mantelpiece above their fireplace, and he lifted a clock. And he took out a piece of paper, and he opened it, and he said, "Mary and I prepared questions for you. We knew you were coming. We saw it on TV." Does that tell you the power of television? Back then and yet today.
I'll give you 2 other interesting pieces. Literally the night, and he drove it, the candidate drove it, the night he won the primary. We did not know we were going to win the primary, or am I wrong? It was up in the air.
Yeah.
The night, and the press came to him, and they said, "Well, what do you do now?" And Pat said, "Well, tomorrow morning, I get up and go knock on doors." Now, trust me, I was there. There was some drinking that night. He did not want to get up and go knock on doors, but he did.
Yeah.
He did, and I know that because he made me go with him. Second one, and it just sticks in my mind. If you just take this explosive thing, which is meaningful to people, it has to be meaningful, but you repeat it. Pat was in Kalispell at a television station, and the television station said, you know, we do holiday greetings whenever somebody comes in. So Thanksgiving's coming up, and wondered if you, this is the general, wondered if you'd do a greeting. And they run these little greetings from celebrities and people that come in. And Pat's greeting was, from Carol and I's door to your door, Happy Thanksgiving. Bang.
Well, you know, Pat, when you say that, it says a lot about the strength of TV by having them react that way. But I kind of read it like it was partly that message that was being conveyed by TV.
Oh, I agree.
If the message was Pat William, Democrat for Congress, which is what was initially on your brochures, very pedestrian, very normal, as opposed to, hey, this is something that engages you. You know, now the legitimacy aspect of this thing was feedback. Remember, this whole period of change is about empowering people, changing from power structures and then people being empowered. The feedback mechanism of going to the doors and eliciting name, address, what are your areas of interest, and then hearing back from you about those specific areas of interest.
Letters.
Let's talk about that a little bit here, because it seems to me that feedback loop is what made it genuine and real.
Well, we'd ask them what they were interested in. And if I wasn't the one at the door, we'd ask them what they were interested in. Even if I was the one at the door, we'd get name and address, and then I'd write back to everyone, whether I knocked on their door or not, and I'd write back to them about the issue. Matter of, So 50,000 letters or whatever, right? And then we followed that, by the way, just for campaign information here about the campaign. We would follow that. We end up following the door-to-door efforts just before the election day with a door hanger that said, you know, my staff or I, my supporters or I were at your door. I'm Pat Williams. We'd have a photo they recognize. And then we also did mailings that said door-to-door. So we kept reinforcing it. And but look, what it was about really, we may be overdoing the door-to-door thing here, but what it was about really was we were in a time of change in Montana. And people wanted something different. And they wanted to be able to believe in something. We'd had scandal in Washington.
74, big bad stuff with Watergate.
Terrible. The Nixon scandal was horrible. They wanted to believe in something. Now, you know, just Pat Williams being out there wasn't going to change a lot in America, frankly, but Montana's wanted to believe in something. And so here were these supporters, friends, and relatives of Pat's who would come and tell you about him to your face and answer questions about him. It was the same thing with me going to thousands of doors. They could see me, we could see them. And so it wasn't just me or the good effort of you guys and, you know, another several hundred people. It was the need to have somebody connect with you and be authentic about it. And then, of course, as I say, the times were bad, and so reform was in the air.
Well, if you think about it, this was, even though this was a federal race, it was in Montana where the change is taking place. And remember, this was about shedding a copper collar. I think people were very cognizant that they really didn't have much voice before. Tell us about the coalition that came together to help implement change during this period, and you were a beneficiary of some of that.
Well, let me talk about one piece of the coalition. Workers want their jobs, want to have a job. And Anaconda was a big employer. And the Montana Power Company, a sister to Anaconda in the beginning, were big employers. And not just in Butte, but Great Falls and around the state. All of their workers, and all the workers in Montana, wanted a job and a good job. But hey, things needed changing. And the one group that could have stood in the way of that change was organized labor. But they didn't. They were for change. They were for reform. They were for a clean environment, right? Mm-hmm. They were for angering the boss if it meant raising the minimum wage, even though the corporations will say, we'll have to lay people off. Organized labor knew a scam when they heard it. And so part of the unifying side of progressive politics in Montana was frankly the AFL-CIO and all their affiliate local unions. And certainly in the general election, they poured more support toward me than I probably deserved, even though I was a member of several unions during my lifetime and remain a member of the American Federation of Teachers, Teachers Union. But organized labor was a absolute linchpin, dead certain part of that coalition.
Labor in Montana, correct me if I'm wrong, but labor in Montana was also going through that same change that now, and it felt this great comfort level with this campaign and with Pat. It was, those door hangers didn't get hung by Evan and I. There were a lot of people from organized labor who went out there and sweated and did all of that.
Yeah. Labor, I think that the progressive farm movement in Montana, which was evidenced by the Farmers Union at the time, evolving with, remember the first Earth Day was in 1970, the evolving environmental movement was a big part of it. Students, the younger people looking for change, there was a lot of elements of this coalition that came together. And I think that they were looking for candidates that would reflect that. You seem to be uniquely positioned in that sense, in a way, but it kind of took that. This kind of progressive change, which did take place, is, I want to just take a second and say, is a challenge to maintain. We're doing a lot of programs about how this change took place in Montana. The corporate collar was removed. There are lots of forces that want to create a backslide to re-empower large corporations and dominant economic interests and disempower people.
They seem to be doing pretty well. If not in Montana, they are in this country, those retrograde forces.
It's a challenge. It's a real challenge that part of the reason we're telling this story about the progressive change in Montana was to set a context for new generations to look at when they look at our series and say, there was change that took place. I didn't know about the copper collar. I didn't know that it had to be taken off. I'm not going to let it be put back on again, symbolically, a copper collar put back on again. I think that's part of the message of what we're trying to do, because it is easy to slide back. Power and money are very pervasive and persuasive in the political arena. Well, Michael, you're up here for a nice visit. We're so glad you were able to come back and join us and with some thoughts about the campaign. Pat, both of you good friends, and thank you, but I'm being very objective about this stuff and dealing with you. You were part of a critical change in Montana. So thank you for coming and sharing your experiences with us. We're going to talk about a lot more things in future episodes, and but your personal participation and your involvement in the '78 campaign are part of the fabric of Montana history right now, the kind of fabric we want to discuss in this wonderful series. So thank you both for coming.
Thanks to you for doing it.
Thanks for doing this series. This is an important series, and it's archivable. Right? This is great.
Yeah.